Welcome to Biota Live. I'm Tom Bartley, and this is being recorded live on TalkShoe October 23rd, 2010. Biota Live is a continuation of the Biota podcast. For more information on the Biota podcast, please go to biota.org/podcast. And, I'd like to start with an apology. We haven't been recording a lot of Biota Lives recently. I had a Springer chapter due and various other family-related things going on currently. But, of course, the big news was released a little earlier this week with the conversation with Miro Karpish associated with the Artificial Life Forum. So I've been putting a bit of time into getting the Artificial Life Forum online, and certainly it will probably be launched quite officially through a Biota Live with probably a number of guests. I think we have Eric Burton in the chat, so I'd just like to send a hello out to Eric. Eric will be appearing on the next Biota Live in 2 weeks' time, where I guess the topic will be his ongoing development. And it'd be wonderful catching up with Eric. Obviously, we've been following the Critter Ding, Critter Drug, Critter et al. Developments, and Eric has been a kind of community leader in that development. And I think the last group of folk we had on was Sam Smith, known as SEH, and his associate as well in Philadelphia. I forget that fellow's name. Apologies out if that fellow's listening in as well, because yes, it's wonderful to get updates associated with all artificial life projects. So. Artificial life-related news. There have been lots of emails coming through the Artificial Life Announce mailing list associated with various conferences and things that are going on in Europe currently. And, yes, that's an important point. The reason we are now recording on Saturday mornings is to open up Biota Live to a lot of our European listeners. We have a lot of folk who listen in the UK and Europe. Obviously, the history associated with the recent Artificial Life conferences has been, the UK and Europe have featured rather heavily. So for folks listening in who are in the UK and Europe, please consider calling into Biota Live. We will have on Tim Taylor today, who's, I believe, either calling in from Edinburgh or London. It appears he keeps rather equidistant between those 2 points. And yes, we're interested in reaching out to the European artificial life community probably for the next few Biota Lives, actually. So I'd like to welcome Tim Taylor to Biota Live. Tim, as this is your first time on Biota Live, would you like to give some introduction to who you are and how you got interested in artificial life?
Yes, absolutely. And first of all, just it's great to actually be talking to you, Tom. I've been listening to the podcast for a number of years now, I'd like to thank you actually for all the work you do in producing the podcasts, and it's great to actually talk to you.
Well, it's good to be able to speak to people such as yourself. I mean, this is certainly the reason I started all these Biota podcasts, was to reach out to people such as yourself, so thank you very much.
Great. Okay, so a bit of background. Where to start? I studied at university. I studied a selection of sciences, including experimental psychology. But the course I was doing was such that it allowed me to do a number of different courses of different subjects, and I just did the things that interested me without any particular game plan in mind. But I ended up studying experimental psychology and geology, including paleontology, cellular biology, history and philosophy of science, including the work of Darwin. Got to the end of all of that. I kind of specialized in experimental psychology, and then moved up to Edinburgh, which is where I am now, to do a master's in artificial intelligence, and that was in the early 90s. And after that, I worked for a couple of years and then came back to Edinburgh in 95 to do a PhD. And it was around that time, it was really about 94, 95, I started getting interested in artificial life and became aware of Tom Ray's work on Tierra. And so my PhD was actually in the area of self-replicating computer programs and evolution, really interested in the subject of whether you could create an open-ended evolutionary process on a computer where you had these self-replicating programs or entities that would evolve more and more complex ecosystems and more complex individual behavior over a prolonged period of time. And that's basically been my research interest since then for the last 15 years. Yeah, needless to say, the PhD I didn't make any great practical leaps forward in the state of the art, but I think I did at least identify some areas where systems like that are lacking in terms of evolvability, and maybe we'll talk about that a bit later. But just to say what I've been doing since then. So in the last 10 years, I've worked commercially quite a lot, and also a number of postdoc research positions. So I worked at Math Engine for a while, which is a company I think you've mentioned a few times on the podcast.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that specifically, because Math Engine did a series of talks and even open discussions at Biota 3. Did you attend Biota 3? Were you with Math Engine then?
Now, which one was Biota 3? I went to one Biota, which was the one in Cambridge, UK.
Oh, okay, that was Biota 2. Biota 3 was the one in San Jose, and I think perhaps what may have happened was Math Engine attended. I'm not sure if they had any speakers at Biota 2 specifically, but based on the contact that you obviously had at Biota 2, they then came to Biota 3 and did, I think, 2 displays. I've got a video, actually, that I was going to put in the Biota feed from their display at Biota 3, and they were also very heavily involved with, there were both formal presentations and also open discussions at Biota 3. And I think Math Engine, like I said, probably gave 2 presentations. One of them may have been with Jeffrey Ventrella, or they were perhaps working together on the same presentation. And then there was an open discussion, at least one open discussion that Math Engine was very heavily involved with. But it's interesting, actually, because I didn't realise that Math Engine was at Biota 2, but that probably fits in very well.
Well, I don't know if they were at Biota 2. I was there. That was during my PhD, before I'd started working at Math Engine.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience at Biota 2? What that was like for you doing a PhD and being at a place like Biota 2?
Well, that was fantastic, actually. I mean, the Biota 2 meeting was amazing. We have Richard Dawkins and Douglas Adams were both there talking, and Steve Grand, I think Steve Grand was one of the organisers, wasn't he? Because it was CyberLife based in Cambridge. And there was this host of amazing people there. Mark Bedeau was there, I think. A whole load of really interesting and diverse people. And it still sticks in my mind today as one of the best meetings I've been to, because it was very small compared to sort of a standard academic conference, and also a more diverse range of people there, and lots of, as is always the way with these meetings, the most productive part is talking in the bar afterwards. I think it's the same with any conference, actually. You go and sit through all the talks, but the most value is actually just sitting down and chatting with people after their talk, and having a sort of group conversation going. Yeah, that was certainly a very useful and formative part of my PhD, just meeting all the people there and listening to what everyone was doing, getting inspiration. So yeah, that was a great meeting. Were you there?
I haven't attended any of the Biota conferences, and there's going to apparently be one in Salt Lake City next year, which will probably be the first one that I'm able to attend, although it may be an informal one. It's associated with they've got a long acronym, but it's the Philosophy of Biology.
Yes, I know what you mean. Yes, I know. I can never remember the full name. Yes,
but if you're attending that conference, that will be maybe even a formalised. Liz Swan is organising a formal track associated with the Origins of Design in Nature Springer book, but I think that will actually become either a formalised or an informal Biota gathering as well. I know a few people who participated in that book will be attending, and I think we'll probably get people like Gerald de Jong over as well for that conference. So my hope is that there may actually be an informal or maybe even possibly a formal Biota, which I guess would be Biota 5, in Salt Lake City next year.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, for me, it's so rare to actually meet people in the artificial life community, and this kind of vends into an aspect of what you've been doing recently. The only people that I've met in the artificial life community, or even venting into it locally, have been people that run an independent artificial intelligence, artificial life-inspired investment company. And I understand that's what you've been doing for probably, the past 5 years now with TimberPost. When I introduce the topic of artificial life to people and they say, well, what are some of the interesting artificial life projects going on currently? I always point to the global financial system as probably being one of the most interesting artificial life projects that is currently in existence. Can you talk a little bit about artificial life, finance, and TimberPost?
In 2005, I started TimberPost with Peter Ross, he's also in Edinburgh. He used to be the head of the Artificial and Intelligence Department at Edinburgh University. And so we were both interested in evolutionary algorithms, biologically inspired computing, and in artificial immune systems, amongst other things. So the idea was to create a system that was able to learn how to invest an investment fund. The novel thing being that it would be continually learning. So we started off with an idea of an artificial immune system type approach, where we were continually looking for new situations which hadn't been encountered before, and adapting to those.
This is very interesting because I've wondered about financial models in terms of needing to model components of the whole system, but what you are doing here is thinking of the investor as being an immune response. The problems associated with investing in terms of either you model the system or you model the response to the system, and it's an interesting idea to model the investor as a kind of immune response to the attacks of the system. Was this the idea with TimberPost?
The basic philosophy we were taking, so we were doing essentially technical trading, where you're looking at patterns of price and volume data over historical data, and learning from that. And so the general idea behind that is that there may be detectable signals within that data, and why that might be. One answer might be that there's investor psychology behind it, and so if a stock starts trending up, then people may spot that and join in, and so the trend continues for a bit more. The same for selling or other more complicated patterns. So the general idea was that there may be these short to medium term patterns that are caused by the behavior of investors and their psychology when they see that a stock is moving one way or another.
Do you have multiple investor archetypes in that model? Are you dealing with multiple investor archetypes and you have populations of various archetypes of investors?
So we weren't actually explicitly modeling the investors themselves or the types of investor, although that would be an interesting thing to do. We were purely looking for patterns which were predictive of a future movement in the price of the stock. But the way we were doing it was looking for patterns which had a good track record in the recent past. But we use some information theory to sort of really understand what a good record would be. So, for example, if you had a rule that said buy Microsoft on a Monday, and just imagine that the Microsoft stock price was going up continuously for a whole year, then that rule would actually be very profitable. And yet it's not actually telling you much about the stock itself. It just happens to be right. So you've got to consider the general behavior of the stock during the period in which you're evaluating it, and also their behavior of the market as a whole. So, one of the tricky things was really evaluating what it means to be a good record. Okay, just to say there ended up being a lot more to the system than just the artificial immune system. I guess, as is often the way in large software systems, the interesting machine learning bit was quite a small part of it, and we had all sorts of other higher level, portfolio level risk management stuff on top of that. So there were lots of interesting problems to solve.
The local folk that I met with, we went out to dinner and had various other discussions, but the thing that I found fascinating was that they didn't use any stochastic analysis in terms of the way that they treated stocks. In fact, it was all discrete algebra and various other curious methods as opposed to actual explicit stochastic analysis. Do you treat the underlying information as being trended in that way, or how do you treat the underlying information?
Well, no, I think one of the things we really wanted to get away from was imposing a model, a sort of theoretical model upon the data. What we really wanted to do was to treat the data in an as unmodified way as possible, if that makes sense, and learn directly from the raw data without trying to make it fit some kind of model. I think one of the things about technical trading and financial theory in general is that there tends to be a lot of work where there are models proposed and people fit the data to the models and then go on and add all sorts of layers on top of that, to the extent that people take these underlying models for granted without ever going back to reconsider the assumptions upon which those models are made out of or built upon. And so very often in finance, you find people using models in situations which they weren't really designed for, and where the assumptions that the models were originally built on weren't really holding in the current situation. So we wanted to sort of eschew any sort of established financial theory and just do a machine learning system based upon the raw data, and we would evaluate thousands of different technical trading rules for each stock and purely look at the merits of each one in terms of how well it had done on recent performance. And it was as simple as that, really. We were looking for things that had a proven track record in the recent past, and beyond that, we really wanted to get away from imposing too much theory and preconceptions onto the system.
The interesting thing about this kind of project is that in terms of the proven track record and the nature of near-term proven track record, what you're dealing with here is just being slightly above the kind of norm in terms of percentiles in order to make a reasonable amount of money. And it's interesting, the use of, in terms of other methods and in terms of direct human interaction, which I guess is the contrast to your method, do you see the percentile gains being sufficiently greater than just the experience that a human may have over 20, 30, 40 years of doing this in terms of non-assisted trading?
Well, okay. I mean, I think it's been well proven that if you look at fund managers in general, if you look at the performance of funds over a given period and see which ones are performing the best, and then move that over into the next period, the correlation, i.e. a fund manager's performance over, say, 3 years, 5 years in one period doesn't correlate very well with the next period. So, I mean, for sure there are some managers out there that actually have a a valuable contribution to the performance of their fund. But there are plenty who don't. And also, one of the big differences between managed funds and automated funds is the level of fees. And so for managed funds, particularly with a human manager in there, they tend to charge far greater level of fees than a simple index tracker or something like that. And that really starts to eat away at the profits of an investor. So certainly one of the advantages of having a completely automated trading system is that it would you would be able to operate it with lower funds and therefore provide higher returns. Now, whether those higher returns would go to the end investors or to the company running it is a question, another question. But certainly the operating costs would be lower if you could automate the whole thing.
You've described a very pragmatic reality associated with TimberPost, and I think the vision associated with most artificial life developers tends to be more, I don't know whether ideologically or ideally inspired. Do you have any interest in terms of the financial system as an actual artificial life system? And is that something that you think about as you work at TimberPost?
Okay, so I should say I'm not at TimberPost anymore. That's TimberPost is kind of stopped. We were kind of scuppered by the financial crisis a couple of years ago. We were working with a large bank in London, but things, all of our customers and potential customers kind of either collapsed or all of a sudden had much more pressing needs on their time other than worrying about a small company with a crazy artificial life system. So, TimberPost is on ice at the moment. But in terms of your question, there's a lot of work, as you may be aware, on modeling financial systems using agent-based models, and also looking at behavioral finance and considering the effects of individual investors and their sort of psychology and behavior, how individuals react to news, and how that combines in a sort of aggregate effect to contribute to movements in stock prices. So there's a lot of work going on in that area just now.
But it appears from what you described through TimberPost that you disregarded that approach when you were at TimberPost. So as a thinking artificial life inspired person, you obviously probably have your own vision associated with the financial system as an artificial life system. Would you like to share that with the Biota Live listening audience?
Well, I should say, there are loads of things we could have looked at, and there's only a certain number of hours in the day. It would have been interesting to do more sort of modeling of individual investors. One thing we did look at was looking at the correlation of movements, of stock price movements between different stocks. So generally a stock market is divided into various sectors and subsectors, and each stock is classified in as a particular type of industry. And human investors and fund managers often tend to think about investment in terms of these sectors. But again, sort of going back to our theme of not wanting to accept any established theory, we did some work on clustering, time series clusterings, where we actually looked at what stocks were actually correlated with each other, which weren't necessarily belonging to the same sector. And also with the idea that these things might change over time. So we developed some software to track correlations between stocks based upon their time series and how those changed over time. And again, that's another level which we never really fully integrated. Again, it's all having the time and resource to do all this stuff. You can start to use that to plug it into the sort of higher level risk management of the portfolio. If you're considering a number of different stocks which you think may behave in the same way, or indeed wanting to add diversity to your portfolio by adding things which behave differently. So we did some work there, but and I should say, I mean, one thing I haven't said so far is that the system was actually working pretty well. It was running live, not actually trading real money, but it was running unattended and grabbing data off a Reuters server automatically every morning, running through the algorithm, generating a spreadsheet of new orders for the day, automatically emailing those to a number of third parties in the UK and the US who were sort of tracking our behaviour.
It's a pity you weren't playing with real money. I mean, certainly the locals that I went out to dinner with are playing with real money. And I think in terms of immediate feedback to the people that are invested in their fund, the real money component is really the critical part, it would seem.
Yes, it is. And that's always something that we struggled with and unfortunately never really managed to overcome. Yes, people don't really listen to you until you've got a track record of investing real money. Our systems our system at Timberpost was designed in such a way it was using trading it wasn't trading actual stocks, it was trading what are called contracts for difference, which is a UK instrument which basically makes it cheaper to trade stocks and allows you to take short positions and long positions. But the portfolio was such, and you needed a certain diversity of investments in the portfolio. So it was as such that you couldn't really make it fly with a portfolio value of less than about £100,000 or something. And unfortunately, we didn't have that money lying around to set up a test fund. We were talking to a number of people, both at investment funds and also individual wealthy individuals who were sort of interested in the idea of setting up a test fund. But it was a case of bad timing. The financial crisis happened, and basically all of this interest kind of evaporated. Well, yeah, okay. I think interest is starting to come back a bit now, but and my colleague Peter Ross is still keen on making something out of it, as am I guess. But to be honest, I was working in that area for 4 or 5 years, and it was fun and lots of interesting challenges. But to some extent, I've got a bit. I don't know. I found it a bit disheartening, or at least not very enriching, shall we say? Well, financially, but I'm talking more about sort of enriching of the soul.
The nature of risk in the US and the kind of investors that I think this local crowd was able to gather were probably more interested in substantial risk for substantial reward, which seems to go slightly against perhaps UK finance. I mean, do you think it's a circumstance where if Timberpost had a US office, it would probably be able to raise that capital considerably faster?
Well, I mean, I think that's generally the case, yes, for any kind of startups. It's still easier to get seed capital in the US than in the UK. I mean, the situation has improved here, but it's still nowhere near as organised and sort of willing to take risks as investors are in the US. We were actually talking to an entrepreneur in San Francisco who was trying to hook us up with some investors there. And indeed, yeah, we spoke to a number of companies in the US, and we got some way in that direction, but there were various stumbling blocks with boring issues. Some of our investors and what have you weren't happy with the deal. So yeah, but I think you're right. There is a difference in attitude to risk taking and investment in the US, and I think things are easier. I'm sure it's not easy, but easier in the US than in the UK.
So let's talk about the fun stuff now. You mentioned being inspired by Tom Ray. I'm not sure if you were at Artificial Life 10, but we had the fellow associated with the Panspermia Prize on one of the early Biota podcasts. What's your thinking about the Panspermia Prize and open evolution in artificial life?
Actually, yes, that was interesting. So Mark Bedeau actually asked me and a number of other people to talk to Brig Kleiss about the Panspermia Prize. I wasn't actually at the conference when he launched it, but I did have some correspondence with him beforehand about it. I think it's great to have prizes in artificial life and in any form of science, have something to go for. I think the way that this prize came about, yes, we never managed to really pin it down to be an exact question where there could be some unequivocal statement of whether a particular entry had achieved the solution to the problem or not. I mean, I think it is a fundamental problem in artificial life. As I say, that's really my main topic of interest: open-ended evolution and sort of ongoing increase of complexity of a system. Yeah, no, I think it's great to have that sort of thing. I think Brig was always up against he had an uphill struggle because of the connections to panspermia, and I think some people were a bit dubious about whether there was some underlying motivation behind this prize or what have you. But
can there be a prize where there isn't an underlying motivation behind it?
Well, that is a good question. I don't know. Maybe they can't, particularly if the money's been put up by one individual. So, yeah, I'm not saying that to disparage Brig at all. I think it was great that he wanted to set up the prize. So, yes, I wasn't actually there at the conference when he launched it. And to be honest, I'm not sure what the current situation with that is. Do you know? Is it actually running?
I've spoken very critically associated with the notion of prizes in general, but specifically with regards to Briggs Prize, it was really going to be a fraction of the return on the $100,000, and it was never really clear actually what that meant. The thing that interested me about the prize, which unfortunately we focused on rather than the discussion of open evolution in artificial life, is that I think it was a prompting point for the community and really could have been utilised at a far greater extent. I think the focus on the prize in and of itself became too much of the game and not enough associated with the actual underlying question and motivating new kinds of simulations. Certainly the issue, there have been probably, I can think of, 2 other artificial life prizes since then that have been up and off, which have had similar curious funders and really just uses of publicity for specific funders. But in terms of the ongoing discussion, we had Tom Ray on Biota Live, I think probably almost about this time last year, if I recall correctly. And he certainly still seems to be haunted by his interaction with Brig prior to the prize, where Brig was trying to get Tierra, or at least motivate Tom Ray in developing Tierra in a direction where it could categorically point to open evolution in a closed system. And I think the thing that interests me about Briggs prize was that there probably are examples of it in artificial life that have already occurred, but just haven't been framed in exactly the way that Brig was talking about. The whole notion of a closed system in artificial life simulations is quite curious as well, because a lot of artificial life simulations are inherently either leaky or have some additional energy that goes into them. So do you want to talk on those points? Yes.
Well, I think, this notion of a closed system was a bit difficult right from the beginning, because, the Earth certainly isn't a closed system in terms of matter and energy. And so I think Brig, from what I remember, was trying to come up with this notion of informationally closed, and I never really got that really. I mean, even in terms of information, the Earth isn't a closed system. We suddenly get information in terms of light, electromagnetic radiation.
But information is also a property of understanding as well. I mean, this is the curious notion of information, that even if the Earth could be considered a closed system in terms of information, information is only applicable to us in our understanding of that information or our comprehension of that information. And there aren't a sufficient number of humans or communicative humans or whatever it would take, even robots, scanning the Earth to basically make the information closed at any given time. It's a very curious problem when framed even in real-world terms, because although, as you describe, energy and obviously stargazing and meteors and all this kind of stuff, irrespective of that, the notion of information outside of perception is a very curious thing as well. And I think this is what's interesting with regards to, stuff that Tom Ray did with Tierra, obviously other cellular automata projects, even Bruce Damer's EvoGrid has this element of information as perception rather than just information existing in the system. Do you have some stuff to talk on with that?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think there is definitely an interesting point there, and maybe from my perspective, an interesting question is how, in a physical system determined by physical laws, do you get things like genomes emerging where there is information that is somehow decoded by the organism and has sense for in terms of that individual organism. So it really comes down to the question of the origin of agency. That is, how in a system governed by physical laws, how do you get things emerging, which you might call organisms or agents, that seem to be behaving according to their own local rules of behavior, and behaving for their own good, as it were, rather than following the standard laws of physics of the system. And so that's a question that I'm very much interested in. And I think some of this goes back to the ideas of in biosemiotics, which is a topic that's been spoken about a few times on the podcast. That is, how do signs and sign systems emerge in a physical system? So I did some work on this. It was one of the last things I did just before I started Timberpost, on a cellular automata system where I was trying to control, evolve the starting conditions of a cellular automata such that it would produce behavior that fulfilled some task that I had imposed from outside. So the idea that I was trying to follow up there was how the initial conditions or constraints upon a dynamic system. And so the idea is that the genome is basically supplying initial conditions to dynamics which are already out there in the environment. And so you get this picture of these initial conditions generating behavior out there in the world, some of which may be beneficial to copying and replicating these conditions, initial conditions, to the next generation. And so there's this, from a systems point of view, it comes down to a distinction between the rules of dynamics of the system, the laws of dynamics, and the initial conditions or constraints. And so there's always this epistemological distinction between the laws of the system, the dynamics, and the initial conditions. And some of the work in biosemiotics, and I was very much influenced by Howard Patty's work in the sort of 70s and 80s and 90s even, on really trying to identify this as one of the fundamental distinctions that has allowed biological life to emerge, and really solves this question of how agents evolve in a dynamical system. It's this fact that the genomes are acting in a relatively stable way and therefore acting as initial conditions. They're not reacting at a time scale at the same time scale as the other reactions of the organism. They're much more stable, and so they're providing initial conditions which generate dynamics, which go back to either propagate those conditions if those dynamics are successful or not. So one of the things when I'm trying to explain biosemiotics to people is that some people get it. Some people think it's just a sort of a long-winded way of describing something that's obvious. I think there's actually a lot of value in the biosemiotics literature. I've also been inspired by Jesper Hoffmeyer's work as well. And what I'm trying to do at the moment is actually, so that work I did sort of 5 years ago, I'm now coming back to research, and I'm trying to pick up where I left off there and really sort of run with this idea of the interaction between initial conditions and dynamics.
Can I push you a little bit on that? Because certainly I think what has been fascinating, particularly in my own experience with Noble Ape, is the notion of social networks and the way in which, from what you've described, the interaction of agents and the underlying patterns in that interaction and the social history that evolves through those patterns creates an additional hierarchy over what you've described with biosemiotics. And the thing that interests me more is that it seems to be almost a fractal problem, that you start at the small, you find a similar fractal pattern, you move up to, as you say, the stable agent, and then you look at the stable agent in terms of its interactions with other agents, you find another fractal pattern, you move up, and the notion of intelligence and agency at each of these levels is somewhat blurred, and then it moves up even further. In terms of your own thinking, is this where you want to push your particular interest with biosemiotics?
As you mentioned, that whole question of going up levels is also a fundamental problem, and yes, the notion of agency gets more and more diffuse the higher up you go. But I think that's another big challenge in artificial life, which maybe hasn't got as much attention as it really should have. It's this whole question of being able to cumulatively build upon what's gone before, and it's a problem not just in modelling sort of artificial chemistries and going up to cells and multicellular organisms, but also in modelling agents and artificial intelligence. Just being able to learn a particular behaviour and then use it as a building block to build up hierarchies of learning. And it's a question, there's a great interface, I think, and room for collaboration with biologists. And I went to an interesting talk by a primatologist last year who's done a lot of work studying behaviour in chimp populations in Africa, and looking at how so these populations were able to learn behaviours, and he had a whole sort of matrix of different behaviours that these different populations around Africa could learn, and some could learn some things and not others. So this is social learning from other chimps in the population. But the one thing that was missing in all of these things was the ability to have a hierarchical learning process where, having learned one skill, you could use that as a building block to build something more complicated onto it. And so I think it's a challenge in understanding that sort of crucial difference, how human intelligence is different from chimps and other animals.
The thing that interests me is computational linguistics as well, in terms of a real thing coming through the social sciences, obviously with some vening into historical computer science at least. But we are now getting to the stage with artificial life, in particular certain agent simulations, where we can start to explain language information transfer akin to what is described in computational linguistics. And I think what is interesting is probably that the social sciences will play, as they have really in the past decade. The Swarm Fellow that we had on probably 3-4 years ago started pushing the boundaries of this in terms of political science maybe 10-15 years ago, associated with using swarm models. But we now have sufficient computation and particularly good enough agent language models that we are probably at a good stage to reach out to a number of the social sciences that are moving over into computational analysis anyway, and provide quite interesting agent models in terms of communication, in terms of learning, in terms of hierarchy, both agent hierarchy, social hierarchy, and so it's a wonderful time, really, because I think the problems that artificial life has faced over the past 20 years in terms of relevancy and application, the simulations are getting sufficiently interesting that we can now quite easily pass them to social scientists and do what we need to do on that level as well.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. It's an exciting time. And also, I think, I think it's exciting in terms of potential for collaboration with other subject areas. I also think that the technology of the internet, I think all the potential of HTML5 to move the web really to a much richer platform where you can do a lot of distributed processing on the client side as well as the server side, and much fancier embedded graphics and audio and what have you. I think it's a really exciting time for starting to do some very cool stuff with artificial life. Things which, up to now, I guess in the last, 10, 15 years, there's been relatively little in terms of really groundbreaking different stuff. I'll probably get some sort of flood of emails having said that.
That's not the Biota Live narrative, unfortunately, Tim. Yes.
Well, what I mean by that, let's just say, let's be clear. So you have a lot of work going on with evolving creatures in 3D worlds, sort of carrying on from Carl Sims's work. There is still work on Avida and self-replicating code, that kind of stuff. And I mean, I'm not saying there's nothing interesting, far from it, going on in artificial life. There's a lot of very interesting, much more applied work, and as we say, sort of collaborating with other fields as well. But I think in terms of pure artificial life for the purpose of just the challenge of trying to create a living thing in a piece of software, there are expanding horizons there with HTML5 and other technologies coming in that I'm certainly getting quite excited about, and I think there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff coming out in the next few years when people really get to grips with this new technology and discover new ways of exploiting it.
So that was a very interesting way of not talking about what you're planning on doing in the next year or so. Do you want to expand on your plans in the near future?
Just to put that in context. So, I've been I was working at Timber Post for 4 or 5 years and wanting to get back into academia. So I recently, just a few months ago, started a new academic job at Goldsmiths in University of London, which is actually only a part-time job at this stage. So currently I'm working there half-time and continuing work as a self-employed developer. So I'm kind of living a double life at the moment, but having achieved at least as a half-time position, a return to academia. I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do in terms of reestablishing research in the next few years. And the problem is I've been out for 5 years and I've got plenty of ideas. So the question is really trying to prioritize and figure out what I really want to work on. Now, there are a number of interesting sort of sub-projects, smaller projects I want to work on. And they all basically involve this idea of interacting with dynamical systems and trying to control them by having some sort of evolution of the constraints applied to that system. One thing I'm playing around with just now, which it's not a big project, but I think it should be quite fun, is I've just bought a plasma globe, one of these things where you put your hands on the globe and all the plasma filaments follow where you're touching the globe. And so this actually came about when I was trying to explain some of these ideas to biologists a while ago, and I came up with this picture of a plasma globe as a dynamical system, and putting your fingers on the globe to interact with those dynamics. So your fingers are introducing constraints on the system. So I thought, well, what would happen if you could actually evolve a control of a plasma globe using a genetic algorithm to evolve some kind of display that is interesting in some way? So I've actually just bought a plasma globe. I've also just bought an Arduino kit. I don't know if you're familiar with Arduino. It's sort of related to the processing language, but it's designed for easy interaction with hardware. So it allows you to control motors and sort of sensors, LEDs, all sorts of electronics. And I think you can even get a library that allows you to process the input from a Nintendo Wiimote and nunchuk. So that's all good fun. I'm currently playing around with Arduino and playing around with some kind of more hardware type stuff. I also had so you were talking to Steve Grand a few weeks ago or a couple of months ago. Now that was very interesting, talking about his symbiosis project, because I had very similar ideas to the sorts of things he was thinking about, in terms of having a sort of Lego kit of modules which you could fit together, and each module would have a different function, like it would be a motor or would transmit an electric signal from one side to another, or a light sensor. And the idea is you could just plug all these things together, and the way they were plugged together, so the morphology of the thing defined its function. Now, I've been thinking about doing that kind of thing on a software level and also on a hardware level.
It certainly lends itself to hardware. And actually, what you're raising is an interesting point that I wanted to raise with you. Symbiosis was released as Symergy on SourceForge, which means that the source code is out there and ready for the tinkering. What's your sense with regards to, and this probably you can lead back into discussion of using something like Symergy in hardware, but in terms of the past 5 years, there have been some interesting artificial life projects that have kind of continued in open source, and the hope is to move a majority, if not all, of Jeffrey Ventrella's work into open source. Steve Grand has obviously put Symergy into open source. You were describing about the possibility of almost reinventing some work that Steve has already done and put out there in source code form. Do you think about the notion of open source in this context?
Well, yes, certainly. I like to release all of the codes. All of the stuff that I've done in the past has been I've released the source code for. But I've been speaking to Steve about this in the last month or so. About the software, I'm not sure this software is exactly the kind of thing that I was thinking of, but there may be some useful stuff I could reuse there. I was interested to hear, though, I hadn't fully realized that Steve had actually made big advances in doing a hardware implementation of these sorts of ideas. He had a grant from the British Academy to create some hardware along exactly these lines. And he made a significant progress, but then ran out of time or ran out of grant, and it all kind of stopped there. So one thing I'm speaking to Steve at the moment about, I don't know if there's any chance of doing it, is picking up where he left off with the hardware. It seems a shame to let all that work go to waste.
Do you think that some of the implementation that is actually in Synergy, I mean, the stuff that Steve has done, is a representation of some of the discoveries that he made through the hardware process as well, or do you think of them as two quite distinct projects?
At this stage, I don't actually have many details about what he did in hardware. I know he was working on these kind of ideas, but I don't know. I imagine it was a lot more simple, what was done in hardware, just in terms of the practicalities, and you can be a lot more flexible and introduce a lot more complication more easily in software. So at this stage, I'm not sure what the connection is between those two, but I'm hoping further conversations with Steve will elucidate that. So yeah, in terms of me using the software, that's certainly something I will consider. That's one of the projects which is maybe sort of second tier of my list of sort of wish list of projects to get on with in the near future.
The interesting thing with talking to Steve on that particular podcast, and I think maybe previous conversations that he's had on Biota, is that my recollection of that conversation, I've listened to it a couple of times since actually recording it, was that he did describe even the software interactions very much in terms of, well, some of them at least, in terms of hardware components, in terms of inverters and various gates and these kind of things. And I think this notion of hardware, at least analog hardware representation in software, has really been a familiar theme from even the pre-Creatures development through Creatures on to now. And I think probably there's a lot of information, actually. I mean, as I went through the Synergy source, I really got the sense that this was, as you've described, a project that had its roots fundamentally in hardware. So I mean, I'm speaking for Steve here. I wouldn't necessarily disregard the stuff that is in Synergy in terms of being overly complicated, because really Steve was still describing it very much in terms of a hardware kind of plug-and-play model. But you described this as a secondary interest. What are your primary interests going forwards?
Well, okay. So basically, what you're normally taught to do in academia is sort of narrow down to small specific projects, and so I've thought about a lot of that. But basically, what I really want to do is create kind of the next tiara, as it were, something which is taking the idea of self-replicating entities a lot further. I don't know. The ideas are sort of formulating in my mind at the moment. It's going to be web-based. It's going to be using a lot of the ideas that I've spoken about the sort of interaction of dynamics and initial conditions, but in the context of the internet. So I'm hoping to evolve creatures which are actually using real resources that are out there on the internet. So yeah, I'm really trying to tackle a big problem of having another crack at this idea of open-ended evolution, with the experience of having tried this and failed once before, and the various lessons I learned from my PhD and subsequent work.
When you describe technologies that are out there on the internet, I mean, the thing that strikes me currently is that there are projects currently being developed in the artificial life community some actively, some passively, that are going out there on the internet already. This isn't what you're describing, though, when you talk about HTML5. You're talking about something considerably more primary. Can you frame, I mean, for example, the Evo grid with Bruce Damer, the Tetragotchi work that Gerald de Jong is doing, the stuff Bob Mottram is doing with Noble Ape Server. These are examples of things that are moving out there on the internet. I understand there are some movements with regards to frame sticks and potentially other artificial life projects in terms of making them distributed and utilising some of these resources. When you say out there on the internet, what are you specifically describing?
Okay, well, what I'm describing is actually treating a web page as an organism, and treating the sort of interaction between JavaScript and the document object model as a sort of developmental behavioral layer, and treating links between web pages as specifying a geography of the internet. So what I'm talking about is having an artificial life system really embedded on the internet using native HTML, JavaScript, and WebSockets, all of that, and all of the new things you can do with HTML5 in terms of web workers and sort of fancy animations, graphics, but having all of these things evolving. So it's actually a native internet organism, as it were, rather than something that you're simulating and just distributing via the internet, if that makes sense. I think in terms of details going into that, I probably don't want to go into too many more details. And one of the reasons for that is that I don't have too many more details at the moment. But it's sort of, that's certainly the lines I'm thinking about, and these ideas are coalescing as we speak. So all I can say is watch this space, and I've decided, well, I've done enough of playing around with toy little problems, and I can do more of that later. But what I'm really trying to do now is create a system that is sort of groundbreaking on a number of different fronts, and to produce something which no one's really tried before. So whether I succeed in any of that, time will tell. But I've decided to aim big anyway, and see what happens.
That seems to be a good theme in artificial life development. I'm looking at your homepage currently, and it mentions that you've just created a new course in creative computing. In terms of these kind of courses, what role does artificial life play?
Right. Well, okay. So I've not created the course. That was done by other people in the department a few years ago. But I'm now developing it in terms of the distance learning provision of that course. So, well, I should say I don't know if you know anything about Goldsmiths. It's an interesting place. It's well known for art and design. It's got a computing department, which is very much sort of trying to move more from basic computer science to more fit in with the creative design aspects which Goldsmiths is well known for. So William Latham is a professor in the department. He works just down the in the next building from me, and there are a number of there's some very interesting people there doing work in sort of simulated physics, animation, computer games, all sorts of things. So at the moment, in creative computing, so the idea is this is the intersection between computing and the creative industries, which include computer games and visual art. There's a lot of sound work going on, and all sorts of creative industries. But in terms of computer games, there's an animation course. There's some 3D physics. We've just started. William set up an MSc in computer games programming recently with some colleagues, and there's more sort of games programming, sort of graphics, animation, that kind of stuff in there. But there's no... Okay, I think there's some basic neural networks and genetic algorithms. There's no specific artificial life units there at the moment, and that's something that obviously I'm quite keen to introduce at some point in the near future.
I think the Venn between artificial life and computer games is well and truly. I mean, it now appears almost like artificial life is solidly in the vein of computer games and a number of different computer game genres. When you talk to people who are either current professionals in computer games or students looking to get into computer games, how do you talk about artificial life? How do you frame that conversation?
Okay, I've not done a great deal of that, but I mean, what I have done, I think I always do it in terms of animation, crowd control, showing some sort of classic artificial life topics such as Boyd's or Carl Sims's work, and really sort of trying to open people's minds to the ideas of multi-agent systems, emergent behavior, group behavior, and evolution, genetic algorithms, that kind of thing, so that they can start to see the possibilities of what you might do in games which hasn't happened or isn't there so much already.
It's an interesting problem, and certainly one which Bruce Damer recently refreshed some discussion on kind of in the internal community. And you take a very similar line to Bruce Damer. I think the interesting thing that I've noted with regards to students, and particularly students who are studying things to move them into the video games industry, is that they have a very keen understanding of the historical element, but they are really fundamentally looking to create the future. And I think this is what interests me with the artificial life community in particular, is that there are a number of strong historical elements, but the potential for the future is far greater than what has occurred previously, primarily due to massive amounts of computation now and a wide variety of other factors that make the future actually considerably richer for artificial life developers. I guess the internal discussion that I've had with Bruce Dane, which you've been a part of, has been, how do we motivate this discussion in terms of promoting the future, in terms of actually, rather than coming in as kind of dusty historians to talk about stuff that went on in the 80s, actually talking about something that really can get people inspired, fired up, and produce the next generation of amazing artificial life video games. And I think it's an ongoing topic of discussion, but one that I was interested in your feedback, and it's interesting that you do frame it very much as Bruce Damer did in terms of the historical legacy of artificial life. I guess the stuff that interests me with artificial life, aside from you need to have an understanding of the history without question, but is the potential for the future and the immense kind of simmering potential. How do you motivate some discussion associated with the future for these students moving towards game development? And do you think there is almost a requirement of kind of projecting what will happen or what may happen in the future in order to inspire these soon-to-be game developers?
From my experience, so when I was working at Math Engine, the group I was working with went on to set up, the two guys I was working with, who were Colin Massey and Torsten Ryle, went on to set up Natural Motion, which of course has been very influential in the sort of games and film industry. So there are some successes there, and basically it just needs someone with enthusiasm to actually go out there and do these things. And so in terms of inspiring students, yes, when I was at Math Engine, and around that time, there was all this talk about could you set up some kind of AI middleware solution for games programs where there would be some kind of generic components that games developers could use to add AI and artificial life to their programs. That idea never got very far as I know. And I think, normally, from what I can see, the code it's not a case of dropping in AI or artificial life from above almost as an afterthought into the game. It needs to be much more sort of fundamentally integrated into a game. And so I think for students, it's a case of showing the possibilities of what you can do and the growing possibilities with new technology, new hardware, and just letting them sort of really open up their imagination to what could be done differently, not necessarily going over the same old things, the same old genres of games, but trying to come up with something new. And that's something that in our creative computing course we're very keen to do, is actually to get the students thinking about new applications, new ways of applying technology in different situations. So if you can do that, then you've solved a large chunk of the task already, I think.
And for people who are listening in who may be interested in the history associated with some of what you've described, I'm a member of the International Game Developers Association, and for a number of years was part of their AI standards body. And the thing that struck me about that body trying to do what you're describing is that there was a majority of the body that could have created what was needed, and there were a couple of individuals that played a very strong political game, one from US defense, or the US defense establishment, that basically completely nixed any kind of productive movement on that front. I still think the notion of droppable AI similar to what is currently available in physics engines is perfectly feasible. I think there have been a very curious minority effort within game development specifically to try to, and it's very much associated with the problem. I mean, there used to be a group of game developers that were very tightly involved with developing physics. As soon as middleware physics engines came out, the physics developers had kept to themselves pretty well, were out of work or had to find other things. I think there was a minority component in the International Game Developers Association AI Standards Group that was like that believed if there was going to be a middleware engine or even a suite of middleware engines that had a shared interface, that they would be out of work, perhaps rightfully so. So it was one of these curious things where the failures associated with creating that drop-in interface aren't necessarily because the technology isn't mature enough for that. It was for other quite curious political reasons. But I think there's still great potential for that technology, and certainly a kind of perennial topic on Biota Lives and Biota podcasts has been about creating a similar thing for artificial life with a potential for some kind of subset AI component.
I have my doubts about how useful that might be, and I might be proved wrong. I probably will be. For physics, I mean, it's a well-defined problem. It's something that once you've got the physics working, you can do all sorts of things with it. It is something that you can easily sort of just plug into your system. It seems to me that the artificial life things are, well, for a start, these systems generally aren't that hard to encode yourself anyway. And I think it's just more part of the sort of thinking about how these things should be integrated into a game to produce a playable game is the problem. I don't see that coding these things is generally the hard step. It's thinking about how they might be used for an enjoyable game.
Well, I think what you're describing with regards to the coding, it's easy to implement an artificial life system, as you've described, without question. The difficulty is the complexity involved in player characters and environmental constraints. I don't think that that's necessarily impossible. I think the thing that interests me is that as a community we probably could create something that could be applicable to 80 or 90% of games. The actual integration of that, the publicity associated with that, and the continued maintenance of that is another thing. I think the problem associated with creating real artificial life environments within games is there for reasons other than the coding problem. I think there are other components that need to be addressed. So I think we're probably in agreement with regards to that. I think it's a curious absence.
Oh yes, no, there are always politics involved in these things, and you have to think about who stands to gain and who stands to lose. But there we go. Maybe one of these days it will happen.
I remain optimistic. Speaking of remaining optimistic, in terms of the artificial life community, I mean, obviously you've been following it for a good number of years now. What would you like to see in the near future with the artificial life community?
Well, for a start, I would like to integrate back into it a bit more. I've not been to many conferences for a long time, so I'd like to get more involved myself. But in terms of the community, okay, so I know you're thinking of setting up a forum, and that's a great thing. Yeah, so I've been sort of sitting sort of on the fence between being an academic and a hobbyist in artificial life in the last few years. Certainly, okay, I was working at Timberpost, but I was continuing to think about my other sort of more pure A-life interests at the same time. Now, I know you've spoken a lot about this sort of interface or distinction between the academic and hobbyist community in the past. I don't know. I mean, I think, as we were saying earlier, the thing about going to conferences is it's generally, unless the conference happens to be near you, it's going to be expensive to get to. And that's a problem for academics often, as well as for hobbyists. So in terms of sort of just general community activities, I mean, I think having a forum is a good idea. Yeah, okay, yeah. In answer to your question, I don't know. I haven't really thought about that. So I know Dick Gordon has been doing these Second Life lectures for a long time, and I've never actually managed to get to one of those. I mean, I think the specific topics are sometimes a bit too specialised for my particular interests, but there are sometimes some more general ones. I mean, that's interesting in terms of an alternative to a conference having a sort of virtual get-together of people interested in a topic. So I guess that's something that might happen. Although, as I was saying earlier, I think one of the things I really like about conferences is the most productive part for me is chatting to people in the bar afterwards. So I'm not sure how much you get to do that, or how much you lose that in a virtual world. So we'll see. But yeah, in terms of the community, well, I'm just looking forward to integrating into it a bit more in the future, and we'll take it from there.
I think you've raised a number of interesting points there. I think the forum may actually well be embraced more by the academic community than it will be embraced by the hobbyist community. I mean, originally, the way it was framed, and certainly my discussions with Miro Karpish and others, were that the forum was going to be really an ability for hobbyists and folks who are interested in connecting with artificial life projects, open source artificial life projects, to get the necessary information. But I think you're right. Probably the academic community would be as equally receptive to that. Although the distinction, I mean, my own view with regards to the distinction between the hobbyist and the academic is increasingly blurred. My concern is that the academic community doesn't understand that a number of the hobbyists, or I consider the hobbyist community, also publish academically. And I think you have people such as John Klein. I mean, you've got Larry Yeager, who's now back in the academic community, but still has solid vents into the hobbyist community. People like Jeffrey Ventrella, even Gerald de Jong, who talks at conferences but doesn't necessarily publish academically. The interesting thing is that the distinction. The only really hard distinction seems to be by a small group of academics that still don't really understand the kind of legacy of open source communication and what you describe here as a kind of virtual online community that has really fueled a lot of the interest in hobbyist artificial life over the past few years. And I'm very thankful to have been a communicator and part of that. So, Tim, it's been an absolute pleasure. I would like to welcome you back on Biota Live periodically, so we can get updates and perhaps solidify the directions of this online project that you are currently talking about. And maybe, I mean, as you've heard with the Evo Grid, Biota Live was very much part of the kind of creation and discussion of the Evo Grid. And if you want to similarly utilise Biota Live as a means for you to come on and talk to other artificial life folk in a semi-public or at least a recorded forum, please feel free to set up future Biota Lives in this light.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. Yes, yeah, I did actually meet with Bruce Damer in London in the summer, which was interesting. But yeah, I would certainly love to come back and talk to you some more, let you know how things are progressing, and talk about some of these other projects too. So yeah, it's been great to talk with you, Tom. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Not a problem, not a problem. As I mentioned at the start of the show, we are recording now on Saturday morning, my time, Saturday morning Pacific, so we can have guests as wonderful as Tim Taylor on today, calling in from the UK, but also next Biota Live in 2 weeks' time. I don't have the date in front of me, but I guess it's going to be sometime in early November. We will be talking with Eric Burton about another online virtual artificial life community, crediting going on and continuing to create great things. So I'd like to thank Tim Taylor again for the chance to chat with him today, and thanks for folks for listening in. Goodbye.
Thanks, Tom.